Hello, and this is the last in my series of lectures on philosophy, and I wanted to end with postmodernism. And so this video is on postmodernism. I may actually, after this, do some videos on the history of philosophy and some of the key works of philosophy throughout at least Western philosophy. I'm getting to know philosophy outside of Europe. I feel really bad that this has been a very European series. But this ends the topical part for now. And I want to talk about from Kant to postmodernism. So I don't know if you remember Kant. Maybe you can't remember him. But Kant, if you remember, said that the content of our knowledge comes through our experiences. But the organization of that content is something that is a function of our minds. So Hume, David Hume, who came before Kant in the 1700s, Hume basically said, well, I can't actually experience the law of cause and effect. And I can experience this event and this event, but the glue that says this caused this, I don't experience that. That's something my mind does to glue the two events together. Similarly, he said with facts and values. So I can experience the pain when you shot me. But to say, well, it's wrong for you to shoot me, well, there's a gap there between the fact of you shooting me and the value you shouldn't shoot people. And so this awoke Kant from his dogmatic slumber, and Kant basically suggested, well, what happens is, yes, the content of my thoughts comes from my senses and experiences, but the organization is something, it's a function of my mind. And of course, Kant, he didn't know a lot about the brain. He's writing about 1800 or late 1700s. So, he said basically, God has given me this mind software that does it. Well, the implication is that we don't know things as they actually are. We only know them as they are organized by our minds. We don't know das Ding an sich. We don't know things in and of themselves. We only know them as they appear to us. We only know them in terms of how our minds organize them. Well, Kant, of course, believed, as I have in a slide, that God was truthful, and therefore God would not lie. God would not make mind software that skewed things. And so therefore Kant believed that we could pretty much trust reality. But the reason why I think Kant is a good precursor to what would eventually, 150, 200 years later, become postmodernism is that if my mind is organizing the data of the world, then who's to say that my mind is organizing it correctly? And in fact, who's to say that any of us have an accurate understanding of the world? We are, as it were, stuck in our heads. And so, in a sense, by saying that I don't know the world as it is, I only know it as it appears to me, this sets us up for a situation where basically truth can be in the eyes of the beholder, just like beauty. Okay, so in the 19th century, in the 1800s, sometimes people disagreed with one or another of Kant's conclusions. So we do not know things in themselves. We only know them as our minds organize them. Schopenhauer, he said, well, we can too know things in themselves through our intuitions. And so Schopenhauer believed that we can have a knowledge of the world as it is through, this kind of intuitive partaking of the world in a kind of a raw sense. We can have a knowledge of the world. So he disagreed with the idea that we can't know the things in themselves. On the other hand, Hegel believed that there are no things in themselves, that there is just us. We're all part of this absolute spirit that's evolving and becoming, or we're not quite the absolute spirit, but we're part of this spirit that is evolving in thesis, antithesis, synthesis, and eventually everything will be absolute spirit. So he disagreed that that it's not outside of ourselves, it's all part of us, right? Okay, so honorable mention to Schopenhauer and Hegel. As I said, Kant believed that God guaranteed the truthfulness of our reason. But by saying we only know the world as it appears to us, he set us up for something like Nietzsche, Friedrich Nietzsche, who would say, well, there are no facts, there are only interpretations. There are only the worlds as it appears. There's only the world as it appears to us. There is no facts about the world that are truths in themselves, and so forth. And of course, Nietzsche was the late 1800s. He died in the year 1900. I'm sorry, Nietzsche was in the late 1800s. He died in the year 1900. Wittgenstein, so I think Kant died around 1803, 1804. So we've got staggering here. Ludwig Wittgenstein died in the early 1950s. So he's early 20th century. In his early work ends with this statement: "Wovon man kann nicht sprechen." Oh, I'm sorry, wrong language. "Whereof one cannot speak, one must be silent." And so, if we can't, that would apply to das Ding an sich. If we can't know the things in themselves of the world, then we should stop talking about them, because and the whole idea of metaphysics and what the world is made of, basically, Wittgenstein said, well, we can't know it. By the way, did I do metaphysics? I'm trying to remember whether I actually did metaphysics. I may have cut that out of the philosophy of science. If that's the case, then I must insert it here, or else our philosophy quest is incomplete. So let us take a quick detour into metaphysics. Now, I don't know whether you've heard about metaphysics before. Some people associate it with New Age spirituality, that kind of thing. In fact, I heard somebody once criticize the NIV. I won't go into it, but basically somebody in the late 1800s who had something to do with the Greek text that dethroned the King James Version. Somebody in the late 1800s said in his diary that he liked to go for strolls and talk about metaphysics. And this book was criticizing the NIV. Obviously is evil because it's based on a Greek text that in part was based upon the scholarship of somebody who liked metaphysics. Well, they were saying metaphysics as New Age spirituality. This is so far from the truth. It's sorry. Well, when what was his name? Hort, Bishop Brooke Foss Westcott. When he went for strolls talking about metaphysics, he didn't mean metaphysics in terms of late 20th century spirituality, but in terms of ancient Greek metaphysics, as in Aristotle, 300s BC. Quite different. Aristotle, the book after physics was metaphysics. Meta means after. So the book after physics was metaphysics. And metaphysics was the study of reality. What is real? Am I real? Are you real? Am I a computer program? You ever seen The Matrix? Metaphysics was quite a big deal of discussion throughout history until Kant, in which Kant basically said, because metaphysics is the study of things in themselves, as it were. Das Ding an sich, die Dinge an sich, the things in themselves. Metaphysics asks, what is the world made of? Is it made of matter? Which, of course, most of us would say, yeah, I think so. But there have been people who've suggested maybe we're all thoughts in the mind of God, and there's no matter at all. This is just, I'm not, knock on thought, knock on God's ideas, which sounds crazy to us. But Plato, in the 300s, kind of believed that this world is a shadow around us, that matter is a shadowy thing, and that the real thing are the ideas that you can contemplate. And of course, the Gnostics were a heresy, a Christian and Jewish heresy in the 200s that basically said matter is evil and spirit is good. And so the Gnostics said, so wait a minute, Jesus couldn't have become human. He could not have become matter, because then Jesus would have been evil. So maybe Jesus was just a spirit being, and this debate actually, before that debate, Christians and Jews had kind of thought, well, maybe the world's just always been here. But then they said, no, wait a minute, God made the world, and therefore the world was good when God made it. Doesn't Genesis 1 say that the world was good when God made it? And therefore God must have made everything. God must have made the world. We call that creation out of nothing. Okay, I'm babbling a lot of stuff here, but basically it boils down to this, that there have been people who have said the only thing that exists is matter. So an atheist today would probably say this. Many modern people would say, it's all she wrote. I'm roadkill waiting to happen. It's just matter. That's all there is. Matter, atoms, all that stuff. Believe it or not, many of the ancients were this way too, especially a group called the Epicureans. The Epicureans basically believed that we're just all matter, and when we die, we're worm food. However, there have been also these weird idealists. Now, again, they weren't weird to them. They didn't think they were weird. We're just so used to thinking of matter that the idea that I might be a dream God's having, this just seems a little bizarre. Remember, what a person finds bizarre is all a function of what they've grown up with. As the ancient historian Herodotus said, custom is king over all. People basically get used to their own kind of stuff, and they think you're weird if you're different, from them. But there have been people. Plato believed, as I said, that matter was just a shadow of the real ideas, that if you want to know reality, then think, think, think. George Berkeley, who is an Irish bishop, he basically also thought we were thoughts in the mind of God. He was an Irish Roman Catholic bishop, right? I think he was Roman Catholic. So he was a Christian, believed in God very muchly, but he believed that we were all ideas. In fact, he said, to be is to be perceived. We exist because God perceives us. Okay, so most of you, I'm sure, are dualists. Not dualists, but dualists, as in many Christians believe that there's matter and a soul. Again, our conception of the soul, if you remember the video on what is a human person, has a lot to do with Descartes in the 1500s, 1600s. But anyway, so this is the basic options. But Kant, when Kant basically said we can't know the world as it is, we can only know the world as it appears to us, he basically flushed metaphysics down the toilet. He basically said, na, 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 hey, 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 goodbye, metaphysics. Well, not really. I mean, but in a sense, he did. He basically said we can't answer these questions because I can't tell whether this desk is material or an idea. How in the world would I know whether this desk is material or an idea? It's like these philosophers are playing games about things, as Wittgenstein says. Now we reach full circle. Wittgenstein said, well, wait a minute. There he is. Whereof one cannot speak, one must be silent. And we cannot speak about what the world is made of. I mean, that's a thing in itself, a Ding an sich. And so we have to be quiet. Okay, well, I am a little bit fond of a philosophy called critical realism. Now take a drink of your coffee. Critical realism, the way I would describe critical realism is that I believe that the world exists. This doesn't seem like boy, Ken, you've got a lot of faith there. You actually believe you exist and that you're sitting in a chair. Man, you've got a lot of faith. Well, from a philosophical standpoint, these are things that I can't prove that the world's outside my head. I can't even prove I have a head. For all I know, I'm a computer program in the Matrix in the 23rd century or something, or I'm on a holodeck. But certainly you might be a product of my warped and twisted imagination. That perspective is called solipsism. That I'm the only thing that exists and everything else is a projection of my mind. But I'm willing to say, by faith, I'm going to get out on a limb here and suggest that the world does exist outside myself. By faith, I can't prove it, but by faith, I'm going to say the world exists outside myself. I then, as a Christian, I'm going to suggest, again, this is not a hard thing, and I don't know that it's necessarily a uniquely Christian thing, but my sense of the world outside myself is always going to be affected by the fact that I'm finite. I cannot hold all the data of the world in all of its relationships to each other. I can't handle it all. I can only, it's like I'm trying to shove the universe into my brain through a straw. And so my sense of the world outside myself is always, always, always going to be incredibly finite. Just a teeny bit of, in an itty bitty living space. It's not, I can't get it all in. And I certainly don't know all of the data in all of its relationships to other data. I mean, this is part of what I mean when I say that God knows all things. God not only knows all the data of the universe, but he knows all the relationships between all the data of the world. But as a Christian, I would say that my sense of the world is also, it's not only affected by my finitude, but also by my fallenness, that I am not a pure being by nature, that I have a proclivity toward sin, as Paul would say, and that affects my skew. I have a tendency to see things in a way that I want to see it. So, okay, it's 2020. We had a presidential debate between Trump and a guy named Joe Biden, and we had a vice presidential debate between a man named Mike Pence and a woman named Kamala Harris. What is, of course, really interesting is to watch Facebook and Twitter on who won the debate. And a lot of the time, maybe the majority of the time, if you are a Trump supporter, Trump won the debate. And if you're a Biden supporter, then Biden won the debate. Not always the case, but there is a kind of tribalism to I've said this multiple times, humanity is a herd animal. And so I don't know how many Trump supporters said after the first debate, well, it wasn't a fair debate because the moderator kept debating Trump. Whereas the Biden supporters said Trump was out of control. I mean, he was just talking over everything, and that he wasn't following the rules of the debate. And so the moderator couldn't even, by trying to step in to get him to follow the rules of the debate, the moderator couldn't get him to do it. Again, so and the same thing with the vice president debate. The one side would say, well, Pence was such a gentleman, and Kamala Harris, was so rude to him, and then you had the other side was Mike Pence kept talking over the women. And so you have these different perspectives. And which one's right? Well, there may be elements of truth in all of these perspectives. How do we know which one is actually the correct one or the most correct one? Well, our finiteness and our fallenness, and I don't even mean necessarily it's entirely sinful, but I can't help but I can't get outside my head. This is why it's good for us to talk to each other, because you can tell me what's inside your head, and I can tell you what's inside my head, and perhaps we can meet in the middle somewhere. But critical realism would say, yes, there is truth on many things. There is a world outside of me that exists, but my sense of that world is always affected by the fact that I'm finite and fallen. And so I probably need another bullet here. So let's add a bullet. Okay, there. I can't believe I'm doing this, but I'm going to quote an old history professor from Indiana Wesleyan University named Glenn Martin, who used to quote 1 Corinthians 13 that says we see through a glass darkly, but then he would say, but we see. And I have respect for Dr. Martin. He's been gone for over a decade now, but he and I came from quite different philosophical viewpoints. But I think when I was making this bulletin, I thought, well, I need a summary of critical realism. This, I think, is a good summary of critical realism. That the consequence of the fact that we are finite and fallen is that our perception of reality is always going to be skewed to some extent, or at least it's not going to be, it's the vast majority of the time, our sense of what is true and what is real is going to be skewed. However, he always ended up, but we do see. We see darkly. We don't see quite crisply, but we see. And I think this is probably a fair expression of critical realism. The sense that there are better and worse explanations of things. I have an opinion on the debates, for example. I have an opinion on debate between Trump and Biden, and I have an opinion on Harris and Pence. I'm not going to tell you what it is, but I have an opinion on which of the interpretations is more objective. Now, I may be wrong. Maybe I just haven't quite, maybe it hasn't quite gotten through to me how dark my vision of the world is, or unclear my vision of the world is. But critical realism, as I would sum it up, is, in this last bullet here, is that we inevitably, all of us have a skewed, none of us are objective. We all have a skewed sense of what is real and what is true. But that doesn't mean that we don't see truth, or that we cannot see truth. And by the way, our understanding of the Bible is not exempt from this. This is something I've said in these videos and that I don't think people realize is, it's not like the Bible is just, I'm gonna input the Bible into me and it'll be in there. You have to interpret the Bible. And so it's not enough to say, well, I believe, I'm going to stand on what the Bible says. You're interpreting the Bible. In fact, because you don't realize you're interpreting the Bible, you're setting yourself up as God, which is kind of blasphemous. And so it's not enough to say, well, I'm just going to do what the Bible says, because you're interpreting the Bible and you see the Bible through a glass darkly. Now, I'm a Bible scholar. I haven't given up. I have opinions on what the Bible means. I have not given up. But this is critical realism is a consequence of this fact that we're all stuck in our heads and we're stuck in our tribes, that we don't see the world as it is. We see it darkly and in a skewed fashion and in a finite way. But we shouldn't give up the pursuit of truth. Let me give you the pragmatic realistic perspective, which is a little bit just one beyond critical realism. So critical realism believes there is truth. It's just our access to it is skewed and a little bit affected. Richard Rorty, who I'm going to mention in a second, would say, well, it's really about what works. Rorty would say, well, there is no truth, really, I think Rorty would say. Rorty would just say that there are some theoretical frameworks that express the world better than others. There are some understandings of the world that predict the future, the events, better than others. But that's not, I think Rorty would say, he's passed recently, last 20 years. Actually, the last 10 years, I think he died. But anyway, I think Rorty would say, there's no, we shouldn't deceive ourselves into thinking there's actually truth out there. But some ways of looking at the world work better than others, kind of pragmatic realism. All right, well, this has been a diversion into metaphysics. And again, after Kant, we have to say that metaphysics has fallen upon hard times. And so eventually, modernism gave way to postmodernism. Postmodernism basically means after modernism. Modernism strove to be objective, to Spock, to have this kind of reflective understanding of the world. Using our senses and our rationality, we can arrive at the truth. Postmodernism basically said, well, nice try. Postmodernism was a term that was, I think, first, the person who first used this term was Francois Lyotard. And there should be a little cedilla under here, a little number 5 hanging on the C. Francois Lyotard, who was a French person, and he basically described postmodernism as incredulity toward meta-narratives. What is a meta-narrative? Well, a meta-narrative is a overarching perspective, a worldview even, if you would, but of course, more likely in a narrative kind of form. So we have a meta-narrative, a Christian meta-narrative. A Christian meta-narrative talks about creation, fall, salvation, redemption, eschatology at the end, where there's the consummation of the creation. All these things is kind of a meta-narrative. It's a story. A meta in this context means along or kind of after thinking, standing outside. So if you have a meta discussion, that's a discussion about a discussion. So a meta-narrative is a story outside of what that takes the data of the world and puts it into an overarching story. And so what Lyotard is basically saying is that all of these, all of the glue that we use to give meaning to the world is more us than the world. Remember Kant talked about how our minds glue the world together, mind software, as it were. Uh, Lyotard was basically saying, when we try to give meaning to the world, or when we try to glue the world together into, well, here's what's really going on here. That postmodernism basically says that's a lot of us and not a lot of the world. That we are more imposing meaning on the world than identifying meaning that is actually there. And so that's the birth more or less of postmodernism. I've talked about Thomas Kuhn in the Philosophy of Science video, and as you remember in his book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, in his first edition. Now he kind of stepped back a little bit from the brink for his second edition, but in his first edition, Thomas Kuhn basically said there is no progress in science. Evolution's no better than creationism. It's just a matter of change. Science is always going to be changing. Now, in his second edition, he came back a little bit from the brink and said, oh, okay, there may be some progress, in science. And I actually do believe that there is progress in science because, remember, I'm taking the standpoint of critical realism. Even from the standpoint of pragmatic realism, we are getting better at theoretical frameworks. So the theoretical framework of quantum physics is a more precise theoretical, or a more productive and useful theoretical framework than Newton's philosophy. The sense that the Earth goes around the sun is a more fruitful and useful schema than Ptolemy's, in which the Earth was at the center of the universe. So I'm not buying Kuhn's first edition, where science is not really getting anywhere. I have a cell phone. 50 years ago, they didn't have cell phones. Science is getting better at its descriptions, or its working theoretical frameworks. It's getting better. And so I don't buy it. But I do understand, and Kuhn is a testament to the skewedness of our understandings at any particular time. A testament to critical realism. I'll use them again to support critical realism, that scientific theories are never, well, it doesn't seem like scientific theories arrive. They're constantly refining themselves. Now, I'm not expecting us to say, well, you realize that now that we understand things better, the Earth actually is the center of the universe. I mean, it's possible. I mean, we could find that because of some hyper-relativistic, dark matter, dark energy, formula, that actually the Earth is the center of everything. But who knew? It's possible. Not expecting that to happen. There was a very postmodern first edition of Kuhn's book, and I think that ultimately I'll settle for a more critical realism. The Trinity. So the Trinity of postmodernism, in my mind, is Michel Foucault, Jacques Derrida, and Richard Rorty. I've already mentioned Richard Rorty, right? Richard Rorty, pragmatic realism. Let's stop talking about what is true about the world, and let's just talk about what works in our discussions of the world. Well, I mean, you can have both. I think we can both talk about the truth of the world and the fact that some theoretical frameworks are more useful than others. I think those can be combined in critical realism. But let's go back. Michel Foucault, I've mentioned him, I think, in a previous video as well. If you remember, Francis Bacon said that knowledge is power. Foucault was more knowledge is violence, or power is knowledge. And if you go back to my video, I think it was on the philosophy of science, Foucault basically would say that history is this, again, much as Kuhn said, history is this, these changing paradigms, these changing perspectives on things. And in that video, I talk about how he talks about how the understanding of crime and punishment has changed over time, how the understanding of insanity has changed over time, how the understanding of sexuality has changed over time. Now, I think that in the areas that Foucault talks about, that there is less of a movement toward truth than there is in science. So it seems to me that, in a sense, what Foucault is describing is cultural change. Culture will continue to change as long as humanity is on the earth, and different cultures will have different paradigms that they use to look at the world. I don't necessarily see these paradigms as, now I'm gonna come back in a second, but let me start off with a claim that cultural paradigms are not so much better or worse than each other. They're just different. So culture in Europe, culture in Russia, culture in Africa, culture in China, culture in South America, culture in the United States, subcultures in the United States, white culture, black culture, Hispanic culture, that these cultural perspectives and paradigms, I want to say, are not so much better or worse than each other. They're different. And so Foucault does indeed catalog perhaps some paradigm shifts in the way history is understood or the way crime is understood, and so forth. I'm not sure whether, now, having said that it's not so much better or worse, it's just change and difference. I do, and this is controversial, I do think that there are certain aspects of culture that work better than others, and there are certain aspects of culture that can be immoral. And it's a really controversial thing for me to say this, but I mean, let me give you an example. Female circumcision in Africa has been very prevalent, and I hope it's on the decline now. But a pure relativist would say, well, Ken, you can't say that female circumcision is better or worse than non-female circumcision. But I think I can, because if you adopt the universal value that well, again, I'm sorry, I don't want to make you uncomfortable, but that individual sexual pleasure should not be arbitrarily removed from a person. What I'm getting at is female circumcision, as I understand it in African culture, is it's associated with the idea of limiting a woman's sexual pleasure so that she won't have an affair on her husband. Now, maybe I misunderstand the cultural dynamic there, but if I understand the cultural dynamic there, it is an oppressive practice. It is a tool of male domination, as if women are the ones who are more often, to sleep around than men. Now, again, maybe that's cultural too. But what I'm getting at is, I think that especially as a Christian, where love for everybody equally is a universal dynamic, I think that we can argue that female circumcision is a unjust practice and a defect of particular cultures. Now, could have picked another aspect of, could have easily picked aspects of, say, white American culture to critique as well. So what I'm getting at is that I do believe that there are some universal moral values that I talked about back in ethics that are focused on the idea of loving your neighbors yourself, that can critique cultures morally, all cultures, American culture. So I mean, just American culture, white American culture sometimes can be capitalist in a way that is oppressive. There would be something that we could critique about white American culture. What I'm getting at is, I don't necessarily, although I do think that cultural differences are largely just differences, not better or worse. It's just about, and that over time, cultural change is not necessarily better or worse, it's change. I do believe that there are universal standards that we can, and usefulness standards, Richard Rorty pragmatic standards, that we can bring to bear on culture to say, well, this works a lot better if this is your goal. in this culture than it does in this culture. Anyway, I'm going to move on, but I think you get the picture. Jacques Derrida. Derrida was also French, and he's known for something called deconstruction. I think I mentioned it in my video on the philosophy of language. I take from Derrida the sense that language is far more ambiguous than maybe we realize. However, I don't agree with him. I mean, we laugh at some of his stuff because, you know, we can get the meaning of it. And so, yes, it's true that almost any statement can be misunderstood. Yes, it's true that language is ambiguous. Thank you, Derrida. You spent a whole lifetime coming up with that point. However, I don't believe that he ultimately succeeds in arguing that or implying that the meaning of language is so ambiguous and uncertain that we can't even have communication, because we do have communication. And so thank you, Jacques. It's been nice. Again, Richard Rorty, although I do believe that truth exists and that the world exists, you can tell from my talk about usefulness and more effectiveness of certain beliefs and practices that I have absorbed at least a little bit of his pragmatic realism. Well, this video is over. I've given you a little bit of taste of postmodernism, I hope. Postmodernism basically is a questioning of modernism. I think ultimately we have to go on with life, right? We can't question everything. You know, we'd never get from A to B. You know, is this floor real, or is this an illusion? And I'm going to fall to my death. Oh, what will happen when I turn this key? Is this key real? Ultimately, you've got to get a job, most of us, and you've got to go to work and pretend like the world exists. But postmodernism is a kind of a warning or a spanking, you know, a bad metaphor. Anyway, but postmodernism basically says things aren't nearly as objective as you think they are. And you may think that you know what is true, but there's a lot more doubt about what's true than you probably realize. And that's kind of postmodernism as a philosophy. Now, there was kind of postmodernism in terms of culture that was very, very much a fad, you know, around the first decade of the 21st century in the 2000s. You know, postmodern was the cultural thing. And that kind of is, you know, we're now postmodern in that sense. But the philosophy postmodern is basically a warning to say, you're stuck in your head, Ken. And while you like to think that you know what's real and what's true, there's a whole lot more of you in what you think is true than you may want to acknowledge. Well, this has been a video on postmodernism and metaphysique.